Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Miranda again. Um, I'm doing today's lesson on point of view in literature text for Sun Devil Learning Labs. Before we start the lesson, please take out your writer's notebook and a pencil to write with so you can take down some notes. Again, as always, pause the video whenever you feel like I'm going too fast. And also just pause the video when I tell you to, just so that you can take the best notes possible. And get the best out of this. So again, pause the video if you haven't taken out those things that you need and continue when you're ready. So today's objective, by the end of this lesson, hopefully you guys are going to be able to say, I can analyze how the author creates and contrasts the points of views of the narrator and or other characters in a text. So that's what you guys are going to be able to do. And today's text, it's going to be a literature text. It's called Names Nombres by Julia Alvarez, but we're not going to get to that after a few things. So before we start the lesson, like actually start, I want you guys to take out or open to an empty page in your notebook and write down these questions and the answers to these questions. I'll give you an example of my answers out loud. So the first question says, what name do you go by and why? Well, for me, I go by Mr. Miranda because I'm teaching you and you speak to your instructors or teachers by saying Mr. or Miss or Mrs. and then saying their last name. And then, so that's the answer to the first question. The second question says, has anyone mispronounced any part of your name before? Yes, for me, they definitely have. People have definitely mispronounced my first and last name. I'm not telling you my first name, but my last name. Sometimes people say like Miranda, and it's Miranda if you're saying it in English. My last name is a Hispanic last name. It's Miranda. I come from a Mexican American family, but you can either say it in English or you can say it the Spanish version. So the third question says, how do you feel when your name is mispronounced? Well, I don't really mind as long as you either say it in the actual English version, Miranda, or if you say it in the correct Spanish ways of saying it, Miranda. As long as you're putting in the effort to saying my name, I'm completely okay with you. But sometimes when I do correct people, they sometimes give up and it's like, oh, I'll just call you something else instead. And I don't really appreciate that because I did tell them how to say it, and I wish it's respectful to it's respectful to pronounce the names of people correctly. And as long as they put in the effort, if they don't get it, but as long as they put in the effort to it, I'm okay. But here's how you say it more clearly if you can't really hear how I say it. In English, it's Miranda.
Miranda.
And in Spanish, it's Miranda.
Miranda.
So yeah. So just answer the questions like I did out loud, but write your answers down in your notebook if you want, or you can have a discussion with whoever's next to you about your guys' names. Okay, so let's get on with the actual lesson. So before we get to the main part of the lesson, here's the beginning part that we need you to understand. So what is point of view? Point of view, so character point of view, it's the position, perspective, or opinion of the narrator of what they have. It's the position the narrator has when observing others and other things in the text. And depending on the literary point of view, that might affect the perspective or opinion of the character or the narrator. And I just used in my sentence, I just used literary narrative point of view in my explanation of this. So what a literary point of view or a narrative point of view is, it's just like the type of person or from which person the narrator is speaking from. So they're either going to be speaking in first person, second person, or third person usually. Most commonly we see first or third person, and then there's subcategories to first and third person also. So yeah, well, I'll explain those, but again, just take down this in your notes and we'll go on to the next slide. So first person, it's usually when the narrator like is aware of themselves and is telling the story or writing the text from their perspective. So they are included in the story. So first person limited is when the narrator only knows their own thoughts and feelings, and they're writing when they're writing stuff and describing things. They're saying everything of what's going on, but when it comes to thoughts and feelings, they're only writing about their own thoughts and feelings. But the first person omniscient is where they're writing about everything going on around them, including their own thoughts and feelings, as well as the thoughts and feelings of other people in the text. So they know what everyone is thinking. They know what everyone else is feeling also. And some indicators that will tell us that something is in first person, and they're going to be using words like I, me, my, we, us, our when they're writing the text. But depending on what we know about other characters, like if we know anything about their thoughts and feelings, that's going to tell us that it's in first person omniscient. But if we only know the thoughts and feelings of one person, which is and it's in first person also, that's going to be first person limited. So as long as I just want you guys to understand that first person is going to be written with words with I, me, my, we, us, or our. And then second person, again, we don't usually see this. It's when the narrator tells the story to someone else using the words like you or yours. So they're including you in the story almost, or in the text. We usually don't see this. There's probably other stories or texts where you do see second person, but the only place where I've seen this is when people write instructions for a recipe where they say you have to add like water to the bowl, or you have to put chocolate inside of this plate or on this plate. So they're saying you a lot in the instructions, so they're including you in the text. That's the only example, the best example that I can come up with for second person, but I'm sure there's other instances, but there's not that many. So for third person is when the narrator isn't involving themselves in the story. So they're not talking about their own thoughts and feelings, but if it's in third person limited, the narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of one person. That person isn't themselves, but it's a character in the story. But when it's third person omniscient, they know the thoughts and feelings of everyone in the story, but again, they're not including themselves at all. They just know everybody else in the story, what they're thinking and feeling. So third person limited and omniscient, these two are the most common third persons that we're going to see. But there's another one called third person objective. Third person objective, we don't really see a lot, but it's when the narrator doesn't know or use the thoughts and feelings of anyone. They're just observing what's going on and writing it down. And usually we see this in like newspaper articles where when it's really unbiased, where the reporter is just telling you how it is. They're not giving you their own opinion about the incident. They're not giving the opinion of other people in the involved. They're just looking at what's happening and then writing it down. But again, so since this lesson video is about literature, we're not going to be looking at an article or any newspaper at all. Yeah, so again, to indicate that we're looking at a third person text, they're going to use words like he, she, they, or them. and they're not including themselves. So why is point of view so important to understand? Well, it helps us set the tone, helps us understand the overall message the narrator is trying to show the reader. And also every character, including the narrator, if the narrator is included in the text, has their own perspective. So depending on the type of perspective or the type of narrative point of view, that will influence the perspective of the main character, or if it's written in first person, it's going to affect the point of view of the character point of view of the narrator. But yeah, that's why point of view is important. So before we go into the text, here are some things that we have to keep in mind as we're reading. So we want to know who the narrator is, if the narrator is just a narrator and they're just telling us how things are, or if the narrator is involving themselves in the story, and if we're aware if the narrator is in the story or not, that might tell us also what the narrator's point of view is. So the narrator's narrative point of view. We also want to keep in mind of the thoughts and feelings the narrator is aware of. So if another indicator of what point of view, or what character point of view is of the story, if they're only aware of their own thoughts and feelings, then that's going to be first person limited. But if they're only aware of the thoughts and feelings of one other character, of just one character, and they're not included, then that's going to be third person limited. If they're speaking in first person and they know the thoughts and feelings of everyone else, then that's the first person omniscient. But if the narrator is speaking in third person and they know everyone's thoughts and feelings, but they're not talking about their own, that's third person omniscient. And the other thing we have to keep in mind is who mainly is in the story. So who are the main characters of the story? We just want to know who's involved so we understand the story. And that's just with anything, like any other text. But we also want to know how a character's point of view affects their own thoughts and feelings. So in other words, how is the literary / narrative point of view affecting the narrator's point of view? So we talked about how there's a difference between narrative point of view and character point of view. So how are these affecting each other in the story? How is that affecting the narrator and their thoughts, if they have any thoughts? So here's the text of that we're going to read. It's called Nombres by Julia Alvarez. And yeah, here we go. When we arrived in New York City, our names changed almost immediately. At immigration, the officer asked my father, Mr. Alvarez, if he had anything to declare. My father shook his head no, and we were waved through. I was too afraid we wouldn't be let in if I corrected the man's pronunciation, but I said our name to myself, opening my mouth wide for the organ blast of the A, trilling my tongue for the drum roll of the R. Alvarez. How could anyone get Alvarez out of that orchestra of sound? At the hotel, my mother was Mrs. Albarest, and I was little girl, as in, hey little girl, stop riding the elevator up and down. It's not a toy. When we moved into our new apartment building, the super called my father Mr. Alvarez, and the neighbors who became mother's friends pronounced her name Julia instead of Julia. I, as her namesake, was known as Julia at home. But at school, I was Judy or Judith, and once an English teacher mistook me for Juliet. It took a while to get used to my new names. I wondered if I shouldn't correct my teachers and new friends, but my mother argued that it didn't matter. You know what your friend Shakespeare said? A rose by any other name would be as sweet. My family had gotten into the habit of calling any literary figure my friend because I had begun to write poems and stories in English class. By the time I was in high school, I was a popular kid, and it showed in my name. Friends called me Jules or Hey Jude, and once a group of troublemaking friends my mother forbade me to hang out with called me Alcatraz. I was Julieta only to mommy and papi and uncles and aunts who came over to eat sancocho on Sunday afternoons. Old world folk whom I would just as soon go back to where they came from and leave me to pursue whatever mischief I wanted in America. Judy Alcatraz, the name on the wanted poster would read. Who would ever trace her to me? My older sister had the hardest time getting an American name for herself because Mauricia did not translate into English. Ironically, although she had the most foreign sounding name, she and I were the Americans in the family. She had been born in New York City when our parents had first tried immigration and then gone back home, too homesick to stay. My mother often told the story of how she had almost changed my sister's name in the hospital. After the delivery, Mommy and some other new mothers were cooing over their new baby sons and daughters and exchanging names and weights and delivery stories. My mother was embarrassed among the Sallys and Janes and Georges and Johns to reveal the rich, noisy name of Mauricia. So when her turn came to brag, she gave her baby's name as Maureen. Why do you give her an Irish name with so many pretty Spanish names to choose from? One of the women asked her. My mother blushed and admitted her baby's real name to the group. Her mother-in-law had recently died, she apologized, and her husband had insisted that the first daughter be named after his mother, Mauran. My mother thought it the ugliest name she had ever heard, and she talked my father into what she believed was an improvement, a combination of Mauran and her own mother's name, Felicia. So after reading that, I hope you guys kept in mind again the questions that we had in the slide before. So again, what point of view or narrative point of view is this written in? So here are some indicators. So throughout the text, we see that the narrator uses words like we or I, and not just in these, and not just here, but all the way through. And we know that the narrator is Julia Alvarez because the narrator is speaking in first person, and this is from her own experience. And we can also see in the third paragraph how the narrator says that her mom's name is Julia, and she got her mom's namesake. So that means she also shares a name with her mom. So her name is Julia, and Julia is the narrator's name. So that gives us a hint that Julia Alvarez is writing about herself and her own experiences in this text. So again, this isn't the whole text. We're going to continue the rest of it later in a little bit. But in the meantime, we also want to ask who else was involved in the story. What are the other main key players in the story? And just take a moment to think about that and look through the story and see who else Julia mentioned. So this is what I saw. You could also say the immigration officer up here. I didn't, but remember, we're just keeping track of the main people in the story. You could probably argue that this was important because that's one of the first characters, but yeah, this is what I said. So my father's meaning Julia's father, and then my mother meaning Julia's mother, her teachers and new friends, and then the new mothers from the hospital that her mommy was in. Mommy is the Spanish word of saying mommy in English. Um, and then also the Sallys and Janes, which were the new mothers, and then the Georges and Johns. Kind of, those weren't like as important, but the Georges and Johns would be the people that were with their wives or partners who were giving birth, near Julia's mom. And then also she mentions her sister, Mauricia. Um, she just talks about her being born and the name that her older sister had. So yeah, those are the main people in the story. And so just write those down in your notebook so you can keep track. So we highlighted the clues on the last slide. This is just this written down. So the narrator is Julia Alvarez. The main people in the story are Julia Alvarez, her mommy and papi, Mauricia, her friends, and the new mothers so far. And the topic of the whole text so far, it seems to be about how people mispronounce her family's names. And so I just wrote down names, but you could say name pronunciation if you want. And also we figured out that the point of view of the whole text was first person. You could say first person limited or omniscient. Just remember to keep track of what told you to do that. Yeah, parts of it was omniscient just because she's told about how her mom's story, but for the rest of it, she's only talking about things through her perspective. So I would argue it's mostly limited at this point, although a part of it was omniscient. So I just said first person just to keep it simple. And that's okay if you just kept it as first person. So we're going to continue reading the rest of the article, or not the article, the rest of the text or story. So here we go. Her name is Mauricia. Mauricia, my mother said to the group. Why, that's a beautiful name, the new mothers cried. Mauricia, Mauricia, Mauricia. They cooed into the pink blanket, Mauricia. It was when we returned to the States 11 years later. Sometimes American tongues found even that mispronunciation tough to say and called her Maria or Marcia or Maudie, from her nickname Mari or Maudie. I pitied her. What an awful name to have to transport across borders. My little sister, Anna, had the easiest time of all. She was plain Anne, that is, only her name was plain, for she turned out to be the pale blonde American beauty in the family. The only Hispanic seeming thing about her was the affectionate nicknames her boyfriends sometimes gave her, Anita, or as one goofy guy used to sing to her to the tune of the banana advertisement, Anita Banana. Later, during her college years in the late 60s, there was a push to pronounce third world names correctly. I remember calling her long distance at a group house and a roommate answering, "Can I speak to Anna?" I asked, pronouncing her name the American way. Anna? The man's voice hesitated. Oh, you must mean Anna. Our first few years in the States, though, ethnicity was not yet in. Those were the blonde, blue-eyed Bobby Sock years of junior high and high school before the 60s ushered in peasant blouses, hoop earrings, setups, and my initial desire to be known by my correct Dominican name faded. I just wanted to be Judy and merge with the Sallys and Janes in my class. But inevitably, My accent and color gave me away. So, so where are you from, Judy? New York, I told my classmates. After all, I had been born blocks away from Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. I mean, originally. From the Caribbean, I answered vaguely, for if I specified, no one was quite sure what continent our island was located on. Really? I've been to Bermuda. We went last April for spring vacation. I got the worst sunburn. So, are you from Puerto Rico? No, I shook my head. From the Dominican Republic. Where's that? South of Bermuda. They were just being curious. I knew, but I burned with shame whenever they singled me out as a foreigner, a rare exotic friend. Say your name in Spanish. Oh, please say it. I had made mouths drop one day by rattling out off my full name, which, according to Dominican custom, included my middle names, mother's and father's surnames for 4 generations back. Julia Altagracia Maria Teresa Alvarez Tavares Perello Espiallat Julia Perez Roquet Gonzalez. I pronounced it slowly, a name chaotic with sounds as Middle Eastern bazaar or market day in a South American village. I suffered most whenever my extended family attended school occasions. For my graduation, they all came, the whole noisy foreign-looking lot of fat aunts in their dark morning dresses and hairnets, uncles with full, droopy mustaches, and baby blue or salmon-colored suits and white pointy shoes and fedora hats that my cousins, the many cousins who snuck in without tickets. So it's missing a word here because it's continuing on to the next, not the next slide, but later in the slides. But again, so we just finished this section of the text. Did you keep track of who else was introduced in the text? So this is what I saw. They mentioned, or Julia mentioned her little sister Anna. We also learned that with her friends, they called her Judy. They gave her an American name, Judy, even though Julia is also English, but they decided to call her Judy. So again, her little sister Anna and her extended family were the main characters that were introduced. There are others like Anita's boyfriends or her classmates or Julia's friends. So you could also add those people in, but you to the list of characters I would argue that you only need to put in her little sister Anna and her extended family. So again, just add in to the character list that you wrote down already, add in Anna and extended family. So you already had Julia, Mommy, Papi, or Mom and Dad, Mauricia, friends, and new mothers. You could also, again, add in classmates if you really wanted to, or Anna's boyfriends. But these are the main people that I think are mostly important. Okay, so we're continuing on reading. So again, remember we left off, Julia was describing her graduation, her high school graduation, and how her whole family came, including her cousins who snuck in without tickets. That was the word missing from the last section. But yeah, so here we go. So, okay. They sat in the first row in order to better understand the American fast-spoken English. But how could they listen when they were constantly speaking among themselves in florid-sounding phrases, rococo consonants, sorry about the 4, that shouldn't be there, rich rhyming vowels. So yeah, let me reread that sentence without that interruption. But how could they listen when they were constantly speaking among themselves in florid-sounding phrases, rococo consonants, rich rhyming vowels? Their loud voices carried. Introducing them to my family or introducing them to my friends was a further trial to me. These relatives had such complicated names, and there were so many of them, and their relationships to myself were so convoluted. There was my tia Josefina, who was not really an aunt, but a much older cousin, and her daughter Aida Margarita, who was adopted, una hija de crianza. My uncle of affection, Tio Jose, brought my madrina, Tia Amelia, and her comadre, Tia Pilar. My friends rarely had more than their nuclear family to introduce youthful, glamorous looking couples, mom and dad, who skied and played tennis and took their kids for spring vacations to Bermuda. After the commencement ceremony, my family waited outside in the parking lot while my friends and I signed yearbooks with nicknames which recalled our high school good times: Beans and Pepperoni and Alcatraz. We hugged and cried and promised to keep in touch. Sometimes, if our goodbyes went on too long, I heard my father's voice calling out across the parking lot, Julieta, vámonos. Back home, my tios and tias and primas, mami and papi, and mis hermanas had a party for me with sancocho and store-bought pudding inscribed with "Happy graduation, Julie." There were so many gifts that was a plus to having a large family. I got several wallets and a suitcase with my initials and a graduation charm from my godmother and money from my uncles. The biggest gift was a portable typewriter from my parents for writing my stories and poems. Someday, my family predicted, my name would be well known throughout the United States. I laughed to myself, wondering which one I would go by. Okay, so that was a nice story. So after reading all of that, I want you guys to think about this story and write these answers in. So look at these questions in blue and write down the answers to them. I gave you guys sentence structures, so you can, if you need them, you can start off your sentence with these. So the first question is, in the story, how did Julia feel about her name being mispronounced? So you could start off like this: what Julia felt about her name was, and then you can continue on. So pause the video to do that. So I finished off this. So my answer was, what Julia felt about her name was that sometimes she wished people, they should say would pronounce it correctly. There you go. Would pronounce it correctly. Other times she just wanted to have an English name. So her feelings about her name being mispronounced, sometimes in the beginning, again, she wanted it to be pronounced correctly by the immigration officer, but she didn't correct him. But then other times she just wanted to have like a name like everyone else around her. Everyone around her was American and had an English sounding name. But yeah, so the next question says, based on other characters' perspectives or points of view, how do they feel about Julia's name? So just take a moment to write down your answer. You can start it off with this, or if you think you can start it off some other way to still answer the question, go ahead. But I'm just going to reveal my question in just a second, or my answer in just a second. My answer to that was, what other characters felt about Julia's name was that it was hard to pronounce. So we saw that again, the immigration officer couldn't pronounce her family's last name, and neither could some of her classmates and teachers. And then the second sentence I put down was, others were surprised by how long her full name was and the way it sounded. So a lot of people were really impressed by her full name, but I don't know. So again, a lot of people are. So some people have really short names. So when they hear the name of one of their friends and it's super long, to them it's surprising because they don't have a long name. So that's how they felt from their point of view. It was a little different than how Julia felt about her name. So here I'm going to ask you guys a few more questions, but this time I want you guys to support your answers with what you find in the text. So I'm going to walk along with you guys with the first one. So the first question says, how did Julia feel about when people mispronounced her family's name? Again, you don't have to answer this one. I'm just going to model it real quick for you. So we're going to go back to where Julia or the narrator explained how people mispronounce her family's last name. And again, remember it's Alvarez or Alvarez. See, I just mispronounced it too. I shouldn't have. But yeah, so we're gonna go back to the text. And here in the beginning, very beginning of the text, we see her talk about her family's last name. And just looking at it, I can see through that, like when the immigration officer asked her dad, Mr. Alvarez, if he had anything to declare, her dad said no, and so the officer waved them through. But Julia, because this is from Julia's perspective in first person, she was too afraid that they wouldn't be let in to America if she had corrected the man's pronunciation, because the officer pronounced it Alvarez or Albiers. But she didn't. But she didn't like the way he said it. But she wished that he said it right, Alvarez. And she was just surprised about how anyone could ever mispronounce the way her name is spelled. How could you get Alvarez from Alvarez? So yeah, so from the first paragraph, I know how she felt about how people about how when people mispronounce her family's last name. So we're gonna go back to our notebook and write down based on what we saw in the text, we're gonna write our answer. And based off of what we just saw in the first section of the text, here's my answer. I said in the beginning, first paragraph, Julia says she wished the officer pronounced her family's name correctly. She was also surprised about how wrong he said it. So that's just an example of how we can look at a question, go back in the text, and write our answer. So I'm gonna ask you guys to do the same thing here. I'm gonna show you where in the text you guys can find this if you don't have the text out already. So read these two. I'll show you where to find, again, those sections where you can find those answers. And then just write down your answer like I did here. And yeah, I'm gonna, when it's I'm not gonna write down my answer like I did here, but I will talk about it. I will talk about the answer, about the possible answers you would have gotten, okay? So let me just show you, where you can find the answer for this one. What does she think about her sister's Mauricia's name? So what does Julia think about her sister Mauricia's name? So let's go back to the text where she talks about Mauricia's name. So here, right off the bat in this section, again, like in the beginning part of the text, a little bit further down the text, we see that here she starts talking about her older sister Mauricia. And here in the first sentence, she says her sister Mauricia had the hardest time getting an American name for herself because Mauricia did not translate to English. So she thought that her sister had a hard time. And then it continues talking about how her sister got her name, her mom's feelings and her feelings. And then there's like one other section that continues off after this. It actually connects in the text. Let me just show you that part real quick. And here's the continuation of that section where she talks about her sister Mauricia's name. And then, so in the last part of the last slide that we just looked at, we saw that Julia thought her sister had the hardest time finding an American name to go with her actual name. And then here we talk about how they kept pronouncing her name, and how Julia pitied her, and she thought that it was an awful name to transport across borders. What she means by that is she thought it was a bad name to take from the Dominican Republic all the way to New York, because no one's going to know how to say it. So those are some of her thoughts. So take those thoughts and write that into an answer over here. So again, what does she think about Mauricia's sister's name? We just talked about it. You can take the time to write that down. So again, unpause the video when you're ready. So we talked about how, or we saw that Julia thought Mauricia's name was the hardest one to come by or to bring to America, and she pitied her for that. She thought it was a bad name to bring across borders. So you could have written anything like that down here in a sentence or two, and maybe three if you needed 3 sentences. But yeah, that's where you could have found the answer. You're going to do the same thing for the third question. What does Julia think about her sister Anna's name? And we're going to go back to the text. And she actually starts talking about Anna's name right after she talks about Mauricia's name. So let's go look at it. So here is the section, like it's right after Mauricia's section. She talks about how her little sister Anna had the easiest time of all because she was just plain Anne. Even though there was nothing plain about her sister, it was just her name was plain. You could talk about how she thought how her sister's name was plain, or how easy it was for her to come to or to be in America with such a simple name. Yeah, so that was pretty much it. So you can take what you see here and write that in your answer over in the slide with the questions. So write that answer in your notebook. So again, what does Julia think about her sister Anna's name? You could write, Julia thought that Anna's name was plain, and it was easy for her to have a plain name here, or here in America, because it was such an easy name to translate. Because to other people, she would just be Anne or Anna, even though her name was Anna, but they sound really similar. Remember how like my name is Miranda, but you can say Miranda. It's like kind of easy to deal with. Okay, so now that we looked at these questions, we're pretty much done with the lesson. So we're just gonna go over a few questions here. So true or false? This is an example of third person. It took a while to get used to my names. I wondered if I shouldn't correct my teachers and new friends. So think about it. Is this in third person? True or false? So you should have come up with that this answer was false, because this is actually written in first person, and how we know is that it uses the words I. This whole thing uses the words I a lot, and this is actually a section from what we just read. from Julia Alvarez's like little short story, or yeah, about her name. So here's the next one. What are keywords in the text written in second person? So you can look back at your notes if you took down these notes, or look back at the video if you forget. But think about it and continue the video when you're ready. So the keywords for something written in second person was, it's going to be you or yours. It's going to be including you in it. So the text we just read with Julia Alvarez, that's not in second person, but I just wanted you guys to remember what second person was, because although we don't see it a lot, it's still good to know. Okay, so the last question is, why is understanding points of view important? Again, covered this in the slides before. You can go back to it, rewind to like find it, or if you already took it down your notes, great. But yeah, right. Think about the answer and continue the video when you're ready. So here it's going to say every character, including the narrator, has their own perspective. So this will, and the reason why this point of view is so important to understand is because the point of view will influence what the reader thinks, and what the, my gosh. So this point of view will influence a reader's thoughts and opinions on other characters depending on who the storyteller or narrator is. So it's like when you're reading something by somebody, it's like you're having a one-way conversation with them, where they're just the ones talking to you and they're just giving you information about what they think and what they see. It's kind of like when you're talking to someone in person, like right in front of you. So let's say, for an example, you're talking to your friend who got into an argument with another friend. Let's call the friend you're talking to, his name is Ben. And Ben is super mad about how your other friend took a pencil without asking. So from his perspective, he's going to tell you how wrong your other friend is. And if you only heard his side of the story, you might side with Ben. But if your other friend Carlos told you the story, Carlos might have told you something like, hey, I asked him and he looked pretty busy, but I asked him and he nodded his head, but he didn't say anything, but he just nodded his head. He actually said yes, that I could borrow his pencil. I don't know why he's mad. He told me I could borrow his pencil. So if you hear someone else's perspective, you might understand something differently from what someone else told you. So whoever's telling the story in a text will influence what the reader thinks about the thing that is being talked about. So yeah, that's why point of view is so important. So thank you guys so much for sticking it out again. And I hope that you guys pulled away the main idea of what we were trying to talk about, which is point of view. And yeah, with what we talked about today, not just the objective, but also just keep pride for your name. Correct people if you prefer to be called something else. That's not being rude. It's just saying how other people can make you feel better, which is completely okay. But yeah, again, thank you for this lesson, for sticking it out for this lesson, and we'll see you in the next one. All right, have a good one.